The novel is titled Silkfish Opium, and it's a love story set during the time of independence and partition. It begins actually in 1945, and it starts in Bombay, and it's the love story between a Hindu girl and a ordinary Muslim musician whom she meets in college. And she is in a music class with him. He is the music teacher, and she happens to fall in love with him. And it's a story about their coming together against all odds. He comes from a very humble family, and she comes from a very aristocratic family who are silk traders. And that's part of the title comes from the fact that her father is a very wealthy Hindu silk trader. The fish in the title is also a profession that her family has been in, as is opium. So those are the three words that the title comes from. And I actually wanted to have a more straightforward title, and thought about many different things and kind of brainstormed and wrote down words and phrases and different titles for the novel. One of the titles that I thought was The Muslim Letters, because he is a Muslim and their love affair starts with him writing these small notes, short notes to her, which she saves in her book and reads them. And remember that this is set in the 1940s in India, where times were very different from what they are now. And but that title was kind of too generic sounding, and another title was The Harmonium Player, because he is a musician who plays the harmonium, and he is a ghazal singer. So, but all these titles somehow I kept crossing them out and thinking, this is not going to work, not going to work. And finally, one day I was writing down just words as to what the novel is about. And the three words that sort of stood out on the page were silk, fish, and opium. And I put them together, and it sounded poetic. And when I ran it by the editor, she said, yes, that's it. That's the title of the novel, is Silk, Fish, Opium. The story is loosely based on a family story, actually. One of my aunts happened to marry a Muslim man, and I didn't know her, I didn't meet her until I was about 15 years old. This sort of secret had been kept from the family. And so I kind of thought, okay, well, what happened here? What is the story behind this? And when I met her finally in the 70s, I went to Pakistan, which is where she was. The family had immigrated to Pakistan. She told me, I met her and her husband, and then from that point on, we have kept in touch. But of course, I didn't know all the details about how they met and what exactly happened. So I knew that there was a story here, and I just started off from that little germ that I had, and did a little bit of research about music and the harmonium and ghazals. And I do know a fair bit about Indian classical music, but of course I didn't know that much about the whole, what had exactly happened. And I do have a PhD in English literature in post-colonial studies, and so my background in that actually became very useful, because I understood the whole drama of partition and independence, and the whole history of the subcontinent and what had happened. And I think this is very relevant today. The story is relevant today because the next generation, my children, for instance, I have 4 children who are in their late 20s now, and they have never experienced this phase of Indian history or never read about it other than in textbooks. And for them, it's something that comes alive as to this is what happened to one family. And yes, this is fiction, but I think that in stories and in individual stories is where we start to piece together what happened to an entire nation, and it is almost a tribute to, in many ways, to other writers who have written about partition and independence and what happened to the subcontinent. It's not written strictly from her point of view. I mean, it's written from the third person omniscient point of view. So it sort of goes back. The woman's name is Rohini, and the man's name is Hanif. And Rohini, of course, when she gets married to Hanif, changes her name. She converts to Islam and changes her name to Rezana. And so it's told from her point of view as well as from Hanif's point of view. So the narrator takes on, the different voices. Well, it is a very post-colonial novel, I think, and the word post-colonial means a lot of different things. And I have been in academic, I've been an academic after I finished my PhD. I was teaching in the US for a number of years, teaching post-colonial literature as well as South Asian studies. And the whole notion of literary theory, I've sort of distilled and kind of studied it in depth. And I have another book on post-colonial stuff, but yes, it definitely influenced my writing of this book, and there's still so much that has to be done in this area, and I think novels have a place to, novels are a medium where we can understand what happened to the subcontinent and put that in perspective. Well, just little things, for instance, I had to look into, besides the music, exactly the workings of a harmonium. When we look at a harmonium, we are, in India especially, we are just used to hearing the sound and looking at the instrument. And I had played the harmonium, of course, and had never really paid attention to how many keys there are, what each and every note sounds like. What happens when you open the harmonium? What does the inside of the harmonium look like? What are the different stops and the pleats of the harmonium? When you open the pleats, what do the pleats sound like? And all those things we just take for granted. But as a writer, I had to really slow down the whole experience of approaching the harmonium. And one of the editors that I was working with had, this is back in the States, and she said to me, she said, well, a lot of people, only people in India may have seen the harmonium, but in America or in other Western countries, people have never seen a harmonium. What does it look like? And make it alive, make it real on the page. And to do that, to show what a harmonium looks like on the page, that's what I try to do. So I had to sort of really stop and research and think through that. The other things that I had to research were the novel is set in Bombay. So, and even though I grew up in Bombay, I grew up in the 60s and 70s of Bombay. So I had to look up, some of the bus routes that were in existence during that time, and I knew that certain cinema halls like the Regal Cinema and the Metro Cinema, which had been around, I know, since then, but what did the insides of those theaters, how were they configured, and how were the marquees displayed in the theaters, and what did they sell at the concession stands, and what was it like when these characters would walk into the cinema hall, and there was the national anthem, and they had the newsreels. Now, this was at the end of the Second World War, so what would have been playing on the newsreels, and how much propaganda was in the newsreels, and so I really had to look into all that to make it seem real. The book has been about 8 years in writing, and I started with just a scene, and I started actually not with the germ of the love story that I had in my mind, but actually began with a story of Rohini's father, and I tried to kind of put that in perspective. And when I wrote that scene, I thought it was going to be the prologue, but as it turns out, it has become, it appears in the novel almost halfway. And you know, this is part of being a novelist, that when you write something and you think, okay, this is the first chapter, well, it may not be the first chapter. It may end up as chapter 10 or chapter 15, but that's the fun of discovering as you go along. And I know that some writers write with, you know, you kind of know what's the beginning and what's the end. And I thought I would be that, you know, apply that same process of writing to this novel. And I suppose writing a novel is also different from writing short stories. I also write short stories, but writing a novel is just a totally different ball game. It's like, I would say it's like rowing across the Atlantic in a rowboat or something, you know, and not knowing what exactly is on the other side and all the ups and downs. And but it's also a very rewarding process, and just, you know, spending a day writing, and at the end of the day knowing that what you've written is something good. That is it's almost like a feeling of levitation, I think. But then, of course, the very next day when you turn on your computer and you see, gosh, I wrote that, and you end up deleting the whole page and you start all over again. So for me, it's been a very slow process, but also a very rewarding process. And I'm very happy, actually, with the production of the book, and with that Tranquebar and Westland have done. So it's a very exciting time. Yes, I do my best writing in the morning. I start at about 7 or 7:30 and just write all the way until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And I drink a lot of tea, and on intense writing days, I find that I've, you know, downed about 12 or 15 cups of tea, which is probably not a good thing, but I think as a writer, you just forget about, you know, food or sustenance or anything like that. And the whole point is just to get things done on the page and to immerse yourself in the story. And I guess if you ask my husband, he would come in sometimes at 3 or 4 in the afternoon and see me hunched over the computer, and I had not got up for several hours, and, you know, probably ruined my back in the process, but that's part of being a writer. So in the pipeline is another book, and it's actually a collection of stories, 7 stories, again all set in Mumbai, and I should say Bombay, because some of the stories are set in Bombay, 2 of the stories are set in Mumbai. The title of the collection is Train to Bombay, and that title is actually one of the title stories, which was published in a journal called Carpe Articulum. And it's a story about a politician who is traveling by train from Delhi to Bombay and happens to meet a Russian woman on the train. And he doesn't know who she is, obviously, and then later finds out that she is Joseph Stalin's daughter. And so that's the title story. And some of the other stories have also been published in various journals. But so that's in the immediate pipeline. And in the sort of the next project also, which is almost finished, is a novella. And that's written in the first person, but it still needs quite a bit of work. So, but the short stories are almost ready to go. So